You're now Dr. Ed, of just recent, was it last July?
Yeah.
Congratulations on that. We'll be presenting more findings from the DNA Atlas, we've been delayed long enough, so I'll just let you take it from there. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Cheers. Yeah, it's now like the spooky tales spoken by Ed. Okay, yeah, sorry, that's just the gump from RCSI. So, thank you all very much for inviting me to speak. I get it for the third time again. That's crazy. I just saw that it's the 30th anniversary of the Genealogical Society. So I am as old as this society this year. It's great. So shared birthday, great. Anyway, so tonight's talk will be an update of the progress and the latest results from the Irish DNA Atlas. I'll be mostly talking about the results of a paper that we published back in September. And that was to do with the genetic landscape of Britain and Ireland, with a focus of the north of Britain and Ireland, particularly in Scotland. But I'll be talking about the Irish DNA Atlas itself, and some other kind of unpublished results that are kind of are interesting, that should be of interest to this audience. So this is the main structure of the talk tonight. So I'll just quickly go over the Irish DNA Atlas, just to remind you, give a quick update of the project's progress. Then for the most part I'll be talking about this Ireland and Scotland analysis, and then I'll quickly close up and give my due acknowledgements. First of all, so the Irish DNA Atlas, this is a DNA cohort of individuals with regional Irish ancestry. So by that we mean that we take the DNA profile of individuals that have all 8 of their great-grandparents born within a specific region of Ireland, typically within 50 kilometres of each other. And this means that every sample that we have in this cohort, their genetic ancestry is kind of a representative of the genetic ancestry of specific regions around Ireland from about 100 and 150 years ago. And what we do is combine this really quite detailed genealogical data and genetic data in genetic studies. So this is a nearly current map of our samples that we have in the Atlas today. So each dot represents one individual, kind of placed where their ancestors were born. You can see we've got a nice coverage across the entirety of the island of Ireland. So currently what we have is this. The Irish DNA Atlas itself is quite a unique cohort, just because of the amount of genealogical data that we have, thanks to the Genealogical Society. And we get to marry that genealogical data with the genomic data that we're able to generate and analyse. And this means that this cohort is really quite valuable, and it's had a couple of very interesting uses in various different genetic research. So the Irish DNA Atlas, because of this value to it, has contributed to a number of different studies, some of them penned by our research group, and then some that we've helped by providing Irish references through the Irish DNA Atlas. So, for example, we've helped research into ancient DNA of the Near East. Of course, our own scientific reports paper reporting the Irish DNA Atlas formally back in 2017. And then we also helped ancient DNA in Iceland. And then what I'll be talking about tonight is this recent paper, The Genetic Landscape of Scotland and the Isles, where we worked with collaborators mostly up in Edinburgh, but other collaborators from across from Britain as well. So, yeah, we also continue to contribute to other styles of genetic research, particularly disease genetics research. So in our lab, in RCSI, we work with neurological disease, specifically epilepsy, as well as kidney, the disease of the genetics of kidney disease. So the Irish DNA Atlas is really quite valuable for providing kind of an Irish reference to compare Irish disease genetics towards. So it's not just this genealogical history that the Irish DNA Atlas is valuable for, it's also other disease-based genetic studies. What I'm kind of getting to is that the Irish DNA Atlas is a really good resource, and the Genealogical Society should be incredibly happy that they're part of this project, because without you we wouldn't be able to do this analysis. And it's been Great for me because the Irish DNA Atlas has helped me get a PhD and put letters in front and at the back of my name. So thank you all very much for that. It's been a great 4 years. Long may it continue. So the project progress. So at the moment we're currently investigating rare genetic variation. So the results I'm going to be presenting later on in this project is based on common variation, kind of tagging the major genetic variation within Ireland. But now we're more interested in the rare genetic variation that's held by only maybe a handful or a couple of hundred people within Ireland. Because these rare variants are rare, they're very specific to groups of individuals, and so we hope that they might provide novel insights into the demographic history and genetic landscape of Ireland. But at the moment that that analysis is kind of preliminary and ongoing, so it's not really in a presentable format. So what I'll do is instead talk about mainly the results of our published results back in September. And as I've said, we've also used our Irish genetics as a high-quality Irish reference in a number of different studies, including Irish kidney disease genetics, as well as Irish travel genetic analyses. So in our lab, I'm also quite interested in the Irish travel genetics. So they are a genetic isolate found within Ireland, and the Irish DNA Atlas has provided an invaluable reference to compare Irish traveller genetics towards. So also we have, so I'm going to quickly present some interesting Ireland-only genetic analyses before getting into the Scottish results. So this is what I've been doing in my kind of spare time when I've got an experiment running and I get to just play around with population genetics. So I thought this might be of interest. So this is basically the genetic landscape of Ireland as much as we know it using the atlas at the moment, using the data that we have, the common variation data that we have. So this is a principal components plots. I've probably bored you with these before, probably 3 times actually now. So this is a 2-dimensional plot, and each one of these dots represents one individual. And if an individual is more genetically related to another individual, they kind of cluster closer to that individual. And if they're genetically distant from another individual, they plot away from that individual. So for example, these individuals that are down here are more genetically distinct than away from these individuals up on this end of the triangle of Ireland. And so this is a kind of the genetic landscape of the broad genetic landscape of Ireland, using about 2,000 Irish individuals, including 200 Irish DNA Atlas individuals. So the grey dots are these additional Irish controls that we've been using. And then the coloured dots are these Irish DNA Atlas individuals. So the atlas has allowed us to really show where, which of these points represents which parts of the country. So quickly, this is kind of 2 great genetic gradients found within Ireland. One's from the north down to the south, so this is Donegal, then down to the south in Kerry in Munster. And then this genetic gradient down here is from the west of Ireland down to the east. And individuals down here have the most kind of British ancestry that is found within Ireland. So these red individuals, for example, are individuals within the northeast of Ulster who have a larger genetic affinity to neighbouring Britain than individuals, say, from down in Kerry. So this is quite cool. What we can do is take these 2,000 individuals and then group them together based on their genetic relationships. So we get instead this graph, which no longer has any grey dots. We've kind of assigned a group, a genetic group, so this is only based on genetics, according to their interrelationships. And then if we take the about 200 odd atlas individuals from this, and then plot them on a map according to where their ancestry comes from, but using this colour coordination scheme, we get a plot like this, which is kind of, I think, familiar to you guys from the Irish DNA Atlas paper. So this is kind of the broad strokes of the genetic landscape of Ireland. So this is kind of like where the epitome of where we are with the Irish DNA Atlas, using this kind of common genetic variation. So we've been combining this sort of data with other data sets to kind of get a better understanding of how the different areas within Britain and Ireland all relate to each other using this common genetic variation. So that's what I'm going to focus on now, using reporting our Scottish analysis results. So in September we published a new paper in the journal, which I'm going to talk to you about now. So we combined 192 Irish DNA Atlas individuals with about 2,000 British individuals. So those British individuals had similarly were chosen based on their ancestry. So they had all grandparents based around this, that were born within the same geographic region. And this was reported in a paper called in a journal called The Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the USA, or PNAS, and its title was Genetic Landscape of Scotland and the Isles. And I'm pretty sure it's open access, so if you put that into Google, you should find the article if you want to go into all of the details. So we took the Irish DNA Atlas and we combined it with a number of different cohorts right across Ireland and Britain. This is kind of the sampling scheme that we had. So each one of these red dots represents one individual, again placed at where their ancestry comes from. And you can see that using all of these cohorts together, we've kind of sampled every major genetic region of Ireland and Britain. So previously to this, namely in Scotland, there were a lot of kind of patches and gaps in the coverage of Scotland in this type of analysis. So the genetic landscape of Scotland wasn't as well understood as it was, say, for England and Ireland, thanks to our efforts. So we were contacted by researchers in Scotland to kind of combine all of our cohorts together, all of the accessible cohorts together, to kind of run an analysis to investigate the genetic landscape of all of Britain and Ireland in a kind of a really comprehensive analysis. And so this is what I'm going to be talking about for the rest of the talk. So first of all, what we did was take all of these 2,500 individuals and explore the genetic relationships between each of these individuals. So first of all, we ran something like a principal component analysis, which I showed you. So again, one of these dots represents one individual, and if they're genetically related to other individuals, they'll cluster closer together, and if they're genetically distant, they'll kind of separate away from each other on this plot. You can see that there's broadly two gradients within the genetics of Britain and Ireland, two broad gradients. One's from England and Wales, so Wales is in Welsh individuals are coloured in green, England are in red, Scotland are in blue, so light blue is the southwest of Scotland, and dark blue is kind of the northeast of Scotland. And then in yellow are Irish, and in orange are the Hebrides, and then in purple are the Northern Isles, so Orkney and Shetland, these archipelagos to the north of Scotland in the Northern Sea. And you can see this first gradient kind of separates England and Wales, and then progressively goes to Ireland and Scotland. And then the other gradient separates the Northern Isles from the rest of mainland Britain and Scotland, which isn't not surprising, considering that the Northern Isles are pretty isolated. There hasn't been a lot of migration to and from the mainland and Orkney or Shetland, although we can detect that. So going into a little bit more detail, you see that some of these individuals in purple or in blue kind of are halfway in between the kind of the space that the majority of Orcadian or Shetland samples reside in, and some of them are in between that and predominantly Scotland and England. And this means that these individuals kind of have a mixed ancestry between the Orcadian ancestry and mainland British ancestry, namely Scotland. So these Scottish individuals here are actually from the northern tip of Scotland in the counties of Caithness, or the historic counties of Caithness and Sutherland, right onto the northern tip of the Scottish Highlands. And it appears that these individuals are kind of a mixture between some of the genetic variation that's found within Orkney and some of the genetic variation that's found within Scotland. And indeed, some of these individuals are a mixture between the Northern Isles and it looks like England, and other analyses show that there is a tiny amount of English ancestry in the Northern Isles, which there are occasionally migrants that come over and move over to the Northern Isles, so it's probably reflective of that. So this plot shows that whilst the different areas around Britain and Ireland are genetically distinct, they're not separated away from each other. There is an interconnected isle, or set of isles, and there are migrants, although some areas have less migration than others, let's say. So you can walk from Wales, the genetic space of Wales, right over to the northern tip of Ireland in Donegal up here, and you can kind of island hop to Orkney and Shetland. So we also took these 2,500 individuals and then run a kind of a clustering or grouping analysis based on those genetic relationships as well, using this program called Find Structure. to create a kind of a familiar plot of these individuals. So again, each one of these individuals is represented by one dot, and those dots are kind of placed of where their recent ancestors were born. And we've color-coded them according to those genetic clusters. So we identified about 40 of these groups. So the color coding makes the differences appear a lot more dramatic. So if we remember from this plot, there is this gradient between all of these groups. So whilst the color coding seems seems dramatic, these groups have got a very fine scale differences for the most part between these groups. Although because we're able to use these powerful genetic techniques, now we're able to resolve this fine scale structure within Britain and Ireland. So we're going to focus in on Ireland and Scotland, mostly because presumably they're a little bit more interesting, and also they were the novel results for this paper. So what we were able to show with a comprehensive Scottish sample in the context of Irish genetics was that this group of kind of light blue individuals that are in this shared cluster, a lot of them reside in the northeast of Ulster, but also a lot of them reside in the southwest of Scotland. And we know that there was a movement of Scottish people in the northeast of Ulster, and in our Irish DNA Atlas paper, our coverage of Scotland was sparse enough so we couldn't comprehensively say whether this sharing was from the north of England or whether it was specifically from the southwest of Scotland. But with a comprehensive sample of Britain, now we're able to put this movement of people within context of the entirety of the Isles, which was really, really fun. One serendipitous result of our sampling scheme from Scotland was, so most of our Scottish samples from the mainland of Scotland were from one study called Generation Scotland. So it's a large cohort of about 20,000 Scottish individuals, and we chose a very small subset of those individuals, of which we knew where their grandparents were born from the same geographic region. And it turns out that a lot of people from Donegal moved over to Glasgow, which I'm sure you guys can tell me. And we found this out kind of by our cohort recruitment. So we were looking into individuals from this Generation Scotland cohort. We ended up finding a lot of these individuals actually, all their grandparents came from Donegal. So we suddenly found that we had a much better sampling scheme of Donegal than we were expecting. And we found that there was some interesting genetic structure within Donegal, which means that Donegal appears to be not genetically distinct or genetically isolated, but it seems to have its own kind of subtly different genetic signature away from the rest of Ireland. It appears to be less affected by the movements of people that have occurred over the last couple of hundred years, at least. But what we need to know in the future is to sample the other peripheries of Ireland. So, for example, increase our coverage over the western coast of Connaught, for example, and also the other coasts around Ulster, to see whether this is just a feature of Donegal itself or whether the peripheral populations around Ireland there's something interesting genetically going on there. Moving into Scotland, now I'm starting to sound like a weatherman. Within Scotland, there are 4 broad genetic groups that we identified in our analyses. There's this kind of southwestern group of clusters, and then this northeastern group of clusters that appear to be divided around the River Forth region. And then we also have this cluster in orange, the Hebrides, that appear to be have hallmarks of mild genetic isolation, which perhaps is not unsurprising given it's the Hebrides. We're able to resolve the outer and inner Hebrides and show that there are individuals, the individuals from the inner Hebrides, some of them can sometimes be found, as in their ancestors can be found in the outer Hebrides, but it doesn't seem to go the other way. So individuals are genetically part of this outer Hebrides cluster. Their ancestors don't tend to come from the inner Hebrides, suggesting that there's kind of a one-way migration outwards into the Hebrides, but they don't really come back. And then the 4th final group of clusters are within Orkney and Shetland, so I've kind of made an insert from where they would be here, just to resolve it in a larger detail. And this was really, really cool. So we were able, within Orkney and Shetland, they have very good genealogical data. Indeed, the cohorts that we sampled these particular individuals from have very good genealogical data, like the Irish DNA Atlas. And so what we were able to do was resolve individual islands within the archipelagos of Orkney and Shetland apart from each other. And some of these islands are separated by about 5 kilometres of sea, even less, which is perhaps some of the finest scale genetic structure that's ever been seen, which is pretty cool. Orkney and Shetland were also quite interesting because they've had this this settlement of Norse Vikings in the future. So we're going to go into a little bit more detail in them in a couple of slides' time. So I showed you this principal components plot, and as a method, it's pretty well received. It's a commonly used method to visualize genetic data in population genetics. But the problem with principal component analysis is that there is a whole swathe of fine-scale genetic structure occurring within Ireland and in Scotland, which our clustering algorithms are able to pick up. So we're able to resolve different regions within these kind of subpopulations. Where principal component analysis seems to be dominated by the major genetic gradients within this data set. So we used a different method that kind of does something somewhat similar called TS&E. I hesitate to call it machine learning. It technically is, but it doesn't. There's not some sort of like AI behind it. So what this is doing is showing you the major gradients within Britain and Ireland. So for example, Orkney and Shetland are far away doing their own thing over here. And so each dot is again one individual, and genetically, if they're more related to another individual, those two individuals will cluster close together, and if they're genetically not related, they'll kind of separate apart from each other. But this plot is able to, in the same graph, show the major genetic differences as well as the fine-scale differences in the same 2 dimensions. And what might be apparent to you is that it seems to kind of mirror the geography of Britain and Ireland in a somewhat skewed fashion. So the placement of these dots is only based on the genetic identity of these individuals. This algorithm has no idea where their genealogical ancestors come from. And yet it's able to show that Cornwall is down here in Scotland, and then you've got Wales also in England, and then Wales to the west of England. We have the Isle of Man in between the borders of Scotland and England, and then in Wales and in Ireland. We have the kind of the southwest and then the northeast of Scotland. The Hebrides and then the Argyll and Bute are kind of separated away from Scotland. And then we have Ireland that's separated by, that is joined to Scotland by a group of individuals that are seemingly genetically in between the genetic landscape of Scotland and Ireland. And then within Ireland itself, we have this this gradient between the north of Ireland in Donegal down to the south in Munster, which is just this plot was really fun to produce. Once got that to work and I kind of plotted everything out, it was kind of, we were able to show both the fine-scale differences within fine-scale structure within Britain and Ireland, and at the same time as showing the kind of the broad strokes of the genetic landscape. It's really, really fun. Sorry, I'm really probably getting far too into population genetics now. So this analysis, as a whole, for the first time reported the genetics of the population genetics of the Shetland Isles, as well as the Isle of Man for the first time in the context of Britain and Ireland, using modern genetic data and modern genetic tools. So we're able to show the Isle of Man in this sample. It was limited to 40 samples, but the Isle of Man group was clustered with the southwest of Scotland, although with a larger sample of the Isle of Man, maybe that clustering might change. And we're able to show that Orkney and Shetland show similar levels of a similar pattern of isolation, although Shetland appears to be more genetically isolated than Orkney, which would make sense considering it's more geographically distant from the rest of the mainland. So that was the kind of the genetic landscape of Britain and Ireland. Once we kind of like generated this plot, we're able to kind of visualize both the fine scale and large scale differences of Britain and Ireland. So we wanted to then focus on a specific research question that's kind of been dogging us for the last couple of years. This is a question of Norwegian ancestry within the north of Britain. So we had, we ended up with a lovely comprehensive sampling scheme of all the geographic regions of Britain and Ireland. And in particular, we had managed to sample all of the regions of Britain and Ireland that had classically been impacted by the Norse Viking migrations. Our previous paper in the Irish DNA Atlas reported a surprisingly high signal of Norwegian ancestry in Ireland, which has always puzzled us because it disagreed with previous Y chromosome results, where it didn't seem that there was a Norse Viking Y chromosome. There are many Norse Y chromosomes within Ireland. So that was always kind of somewhat puzzling. So given that we had a better sampling scheme of the regions impacted by the Norse Viking movements, and some new analytical techniques, we wanted to try to answer this question again using subtly different algorithms and a setup, experimental setup. So we used this new program called SourceFind. It actually came out last January, February. So I think I was working on this whilst I gave the talk last year. So this is, now it works. So in this analysis what we did was take the genetic regions that we had identified in our clustering algorithm from the north of Britain, from the regions that we suspected that there might be this Norse Viking ancestry. And then we modelled them as a mixture between other British sources and then Scandinavian sources, particularly specifically Danish, Swedish and Norwegian. So this is so each of these bars represents a kind of a proportion of each specific region within the north of Britain and Ireland, and the breakdown of that, the ancestry that's kind of estimated to have donated from our reference populations. Now, we're more interested in the Norwegian part, or the Scandinavian part of these analyses. We weren't, because you can't, the algorithm, you can't get Ireland to, at the same time, be in the analyses as well as reference the analyses. Our Irish results are a bit weird in the fact that we have a very high level of English ancestry, but that's just simply an artifact of how we were able to set up the analysis. Hopefully one day when we'll have a load of ancient DNA from both Norse Vikings and Dark Ages Britain from various different locations, I'll be able to rerun this analysis and it'll be hopefully even more tightly wound. But for the purposes of this this presentation, if we look at the kind of the amount of the purple bar, which is the proportion of Norwegian ancestry that this analysis estimates within each of these regions, and you can see that the highest is in Orkney and Shetland, where there was definite settlement and kind of the establishment of the Jarldom of Orkney. And then it progressively gets, this proportion progressively gets smaller as you get outside of the Northern Isles. It's kind of small, but small levels within Ireland and even smaller levels within most of the north and west of Scotland. Within Ireland, that's about 5%. So the estimates around where at that point are kind of, there might be Norwegian ancestry, but it's very, very small within Ireland nowadays. And the majority of the Norwegian ancestry, if you want to go into Britain or Ireland and find Norwegian ancestry, you should probably be looking in Shetland, but specifically the north part of Shetland as well. So you can see that within different regions of Shetland and Orkney, there are different, subtly different amounts of Norwegian ancestry. And this is, so these regions that have the lowest are also the regions that commonly are regions that we associate with migration into Orkney from mainland Scotland, which would probably dilute the amount of Norwegian ancestry there. But anyway, that was the kind of our results from of investigating Norwegian ancestry in Britain, and for the first time showing that indeed actually Shetland has the highest amount of Norwegian ancestry, or estimated Norwegian ancestry within Britain. Kind of related towards this analysis, we also I mentioned that it would be nice to have ancient DNA, of course, to kind of really temporally anchor these analyses. We do have ancient DNA that was reported and available when we ran this analysis, but that ancient DNA was of Gaelic individuals who were buried in Iceland and who were part of the original settlers of Iceland. So we asked a kind of a related question of whether we could trace these individuals and back to Ireland and Britain. So if I go into a little bit more detail. So these individuals were part of a study back in 2018, which actually we at the Irish DNA Atlas provided Irish references for. And they took about 20 ancient samples that were buried in Iceland during the foundation of Iceland, about 900, 1000 AD. And then what this plot is another PCA. Population geneticists love PCAs. And each one of these coloured dots represents a modern individual. So these bluish dots are Scandinavian individuals, specifically purple is Norwegian. And then these other kind of more warmer colours are from Britain, and Ireland. So in yellow is England, Wales is in red, Scotland is in orange, Ireland is in green, and then Orkney is in this kind of a paler yellowish green. And then the dark dots are these ancient individuals, and what this analysis has done is kind of project them onto the genetic space of the modern genetic variation. So if they're kind of filling in the gap, not filling in the gaps, but projecting them onto the modern genetic variation. So these ancient individuals to the right appear to have more affinity to the British references than these individuals, who are kind of definitely more Norse in genetics. So what we did was take these ancient individuals in Iceland and try to identify the individuals that we were confident in calling Gaelic. So these green individuals, so these individuals were classed as Norse, and then these individuals are kind of probably hybrids, so they, within the time of the Norwegian, the Norse Viking movements, of course there were intermarrying between them, so these are probably individuals with recent kind of mixture of Gaelic and Scandinavian ancestry. So we kind of ignored them just because their admixed ancestry would be a little bit complicated. So we focused on these Gaelic individuals. So what we asked was, can we provide more resolution using the Irish DNA Atlas and using our Scottish individuals? Can we provide more resolution than just a Gaelic label? Can we say whether they're from a specific region, either Ireland or Scotland, or maybe a specific region within Scotland? So what we performed was a set of analyses using a framework of statistics called D-statistics. I won't bore you with the details, but essentially what this test does is measure the affinity between two test populations. So what this analysis was doing was measuring the affinity between the group of Gaelic individuals, ancient Gaelic individuals buried in Iceland, to each of the modern genetic regions of Britain and Ireland. So given the modern genetic landscape of Britain and Ireland, which of those regions do these ancient Gaelic individuals share most in common, genetically speaking? So the warmer the colour, the greater the affinity. So you can see that they don't share a lot of affinity with, for example, the south of England, which is a nice sanity check. And then the most regions that are kind of they have the greatest avidity to are these kind of western peripheral populations of either Scotland or in Ireland, which is interesting, and also it kind of aligns well with those are the regions that were kind of predominantly raided by the Norse Vikings. The fact that there is a lot of Norse ancestry in Orkney and Shetland, as our previous slide has shown, may confound this analysis somewhat. So again, more ancient DNA is always going to be good for these. As a kind of population geneticist using predominantly modern data, it would always be nice to have more ancient DNA, but we just have to wait, I guess. But the results of this analysis shows that those peripheral populations to the west and to the north of either Scotland or Ireland seem to have the greatest affinity towards the Gaelic settlers, or at least the Gaelic settlers sampled in the Icelandic study. So this could mean a couple of things. So one, it could mean that those Gaelic individuals are from these regions, although that would assume that basically the entirety of the genetic landscape of Britain and Ireland hasn't changed at all since about 1000 AD, and we know it has. For one thing, there was an industrial revolution which moved a lot of people around, and also many, many different events in between. Or that these peripheral populations are just a little bit more isolated and haven't been affected by migrations since the Norse Viking period. So they kind of have retained a greater affinity to kind of that historical snapshot that's captured by these ancient DNA. Probably a mixture, probably of both of these, and maybe a couple of other explanations. But this is kind of the first time that we're able to kind of provide a little bit more resolution than just the label of Gaelic, which is pretty cool. So I think that's all of the detail I want to go into. So I'll just finish with finishing comments of just what the Irish DNA Atlas has been able to do and what it's been able to reveal, and I'll probably open to a lot of questions, or one question. So the Irish DNA Atlas, in conclusion, has revealed fine-scale structure across Ireland and neighbouring Scotland, and it's revealed large demographic processes that have shaped the genetic landscape of Britain and Ireland, and has revealed, for example, just quite how large the footprint of British migrants into the north of Ireland has been, for example. It has shown the links between ancient Gaelic settlers of Iceland, between modern day Britain and Ireland. And this cohort, as well as the insights that our analyses have shown or have revealed, are useful to both historical research. It gives us an idea of the underlying genetic diversity within Britain and Ireland, so which genetic genealogy and just genealogy in general can be informed by. And also it's of highly relevant to the genetics of disease. So more frequently nowadays, geneticists are more interested in, or are increasingly interested in, the rare genetic variation, which I alluded to at the beginning of the talk, where these rare genetic variants have a larger impact on the disease risk of an individual, and they are also, because they are rare, they tend to be localized in very specific regions or subpopulations of groups of individuals. So this research of identifying our peripheral regions, our peripheral genetic regions, such as Donegal or the Hebrides, for example, and quantifying that genetic relationship between the rest of Britain and Ireland, is really important for disease geneticists to be aware of when they're designing their studies. The project is also a very high impact project and cohort. It really punches above its weight, or maybe just punches at its weight, is probably a better way of putting it. We have high impact studies, high impact journals and publications. We're collaborating with Nature and Science papers. We have this really high quality reference material that other geneticists can use, as well as its output at a PhD as well. Thank you. Again, I feel like I continue just thanking for that, but I'll be doing that for the rest of my life. So the project is also ongoing. This isn't just the end of it. So we're now interested in the rare genetic variations. We have this large cohort of about 350 individuals. So we're going to be now investigating the rare genetic variation and seeing what use of that is to investigating the demographic processes that have shaped the Irish genome. So that's where our focus is on at the moment. And of course what we'd be doing as well is using the Irish DNA Atlas with other different projects as well, kind of increasing its footprint in the scientific community. So finally, I'd like to acknowledge, I'd like to acknowledge so many people. So the research that I've shown you and the results that I've shown you are reliant on so many different people and collaborators, as well as funding bodies. Most importantly, I'd like to thank everyone that's involved in the Irish DNA Atlas, my supervisor, Gian-Piero Cavalieri, of course the Genealogical Society. Without your work and your recruitment and support, we wouldn't have this wonderful resource for Irish genetics and Irish historical research. Of course, to the participants who have kindly donated their DNA and saliva samples for the thing. At a personal level, I've mentioned before that I have a PhD because of this work, and so thank you very much. And I've also got to talk to you now 3 times, which is quite good. The Scotland paper was the work of so many different collaborators. The reason we were able to get this really amazing sampling of Britain and Ireland is basically that no one else was able to get this sampling scheme done. Like, no one else was able to get that whole coverage. It was reliant on so many different cohorts and individuals. We have Icelandic collaborators, as well as so many future funding bodies, including the Future Neuro Research Centre, which I currently work for at the moment. So thank you all very much for listening. If you have any questions, that's my contact details as well. I'd be more than happy to answer.